Psalm 77. Let's read it together. The subheading in my Bible says, "In the day of trouble, I seek the Lord." So this is kind of a typical psalm through this part of the book of Psalms where, we see the writer, in this case Asaph, kind of going through this struggle of discouragement and just trial and suffering and difficult times. And then there's this kind of shift, halfway through this psalm of where he kind of gains kind of the right way of thinking about his situation. And then it ends with this praise and worship of who God is. And so that's a little bit of the journey I just want to take us on together this morning, and hopefully it can be an encouragement to you. And let's just not forget, as Aaron so wonderfully just kind of prefaced everything for us this morning, that this time, it's a little bit of a peculiar thing we do, right? Come into a building together on a Sunday morning, and then we sit there and we listen to somebody talk. It's not something we do all the time, and it's not something that, most everyone else is doing right now on a Sunday morning. But hopefully you hear from God, and hopefully you understand who He is better. And obviously, as we talked about multiplication and church planting and disciple making and everything this morning, the goal for us is to leave here not only encouraged, but more like Jesus, more like His Son, more like Christ. And so, hopefully, whether you do not belong to Jesus, or whether you do, or whether you have for a long time, that you'll be more like Him, closer to Him, maybe going from outside of His family as His enemy to His friend, His child this morning. That would be my prayer and our prayer. So let's read this psalm together, and then we'll talk about it. Verse 1, "I cry aloud to God, and He will hear me. In the day of my trouble, I seek the Lord. In the night, my hand is stretched out without wearying. My soul refuses to be comforted. When I remember God, I moan. When I meditate, my spirit faints. You hold my eyelids open. I am so troubled that I cannot speak. I consider the days of old, the years long ago. I said, let me remember my song in the night. Let me meditate in my heart. Then my spirit made a diligent search. Will the Lord spurn forever and never again be favorable? Has His steadfast love forever ceased? Are His promises at an end for all time? Has God forgotten to be gracious? Has He in anger shut up His compassion? Then I said, I will appeal to the years of the right hand of the Most High. I will remember the deeds of the Lord. Yes, I will remember your wonders of old. I will ponder all your work and meditate on your mighty deeds. Your way, O God, is holy. What God is great like our God? You are the God who works wonders. You have made known your might among the peoples. With your arm redeemed your people, the children of Jacob and Joseph. When the waters saw you, O God, when the waters saw you, they were afraid. Indeed, the deep trembled. The clouds poured out water. The skies gave forth thunder. Your arrows flashed on every side. The crash of your thunder was in the whirlwind. Your lightnings lighted up the world. The earth trembled and shook. Your way was through the sea, your path through the great waters, yet your footprints were unseen. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. So this is all for Matt Whitney this morning because he loves alliterated outlines. I'm going to tell you, I have 6 D's, okay? 6 D's. Now get ready. This is going to be a special thing, all right? I don't normally do this, and I don't know why I did today, but it's just going to be kind of fun. All right, so the first D is discouragement, verses 1 through 6. We see the writer's discouragement. I cry aloud to God, and He will hear me. In the day of trouble, I seek the Lord. In the night, my hand is stretched out without wearying. That phrase right there just kind of references kind of In other words, I am in prayer all night long. My soul refuses to be comforted. When I remember God, I moan. When I meditate, my spirit faints. You hold my eyelids open. In other words, I can't sleep. God, when I think about my trouble and my sorrow and I'm crying aloud to you, I lay awake at night. And then he says in verse 4, I am so troubled that I cannot speak. So I can't sleep, I can't speak, I can't talk about it. It's so difficult that I can't even put it into words. I can't even describe it. Just the stress and the worry and the guilt that maybe we feel at different times. I don't know if you've been through anything in your life where you can kind of relate to this. Just laying awake at night and worrying and laying awake at night and stressing, laying awake at night and just wanting to pray, but just not being able to put what you're going through into words, and just the difficulty of maybe a physical trial, or a loved one who is battling a physical trial, or a financial burden, or some kind of painful relationship or experience. We don't know exactly what the psalmist is writing here about, but it's pretty obvious that it's just some deep, deep discouragement. In verse 6 he says, let me remember my song in the night, let me meditate in my heart. Verse 5, I consider the days of old, the years long ago. He's trying to remember better days. He's trying to bring himself some kind of hope that somehow, if he thinks about the way things used to be in the good old days, that'll help him somehow. And it's not really working too well for him, because it gets worse. He says in verse 6, then my spirit made a diligent. I left no stone unturned. I was searching in my heart and in my mind, trying to find a way to relieve myself of this situation that I was in, and trying to get some relief from this suffering and this trial and this discouragement. And then in verses 7 through 9, the second D, we see this discouragement turns into doubt. He starts asking himself these questions. And I'm sure that most of us in here can relate to some of these questions that he's asking God. I mean, I feel like these are kind of close to our hearts in these times of difficulty. He says, will the Lord spurn forever? Will the Lord reject me forever? Will He turn away from me? Will He never again show me favor? Has His steadfast love forever ceased? Are His promises at an end for all time? Has God forgotten to be gracious? Has He in anger shut up or stopped or ended His compassion? I think that a lot of times when we're going through some discouragement, that the longer we're in that discouragement and the more difficult it gets, it can turn into doubt in our minds and in our hearts. It can turn into us really questioning who God is. It can turn into us kind of forgetting the truths that we know about God, about who He is and what He is like and His promises. And it can turn into these kind of questions like, God, are you really there? And God, do you really care? And do you really know what I'm going through? And the longer we live in that discouragement, a lot of times it moves us into doubting God and questioning these things. And then the more we kind of think about that doubt and struggle with that, then it's almost like it moves us into what the writer moves into next in verse 10, which is despair. So from discouragement to doubt to just despair. This verse 10 says, then I said, I will appeal to the years of the right hand of the Most High. Now the Hebrew translation here is really obscure. There's a lot of different scholars and translators who kind of give different meanings to the different words here from the original Hebrew language. And so it's a little difficult, but in my reading and in my study or whatever, I just kind of feel as I prayed through it and just kind of thought about it. I'm no Hebrew scholar by any means, but I just kind of landed on one translation that the best wording for this verse, without going into all the details of what the words mean and all that kind of stuff, just might be that Asaph says, then I said, I am sickened by the thought that the sovereign one might become inactive. I am sickened by the thought that God doesn't care and that He's not at work. And that sickened, it's kind of that psychological, kind of emotional feeling, when you get punched in the gut and you just kind of feel like you're going to throw up because of your difficult circumstances. And he just really is at the point here where it seems like there's this progression again from discouragement to doubt to despair. He goes from crying out to God in verse 1 to in verse 4 not even being able to speak. And his discouragement leads him to doubting God's promises and God's love, and now we find where he's even questioning if God is even there, if God is even at work, if God is even present in his life. Isn't it true that when we stay focused on our problems and our difficulties long enough that they only seem to get worse and things don't get better? In fact, they just seem to get more difficult. So then we get to verse 11. And this is number 4 in the outline. This is the decision. This is the decision. And this is kind of the turning point in this psalm. We see a real change in Asaph's perspective here. The decision in verse 11. He says, I will remember the deeds of the Lord. Yes, I will remember your wonders of old. Verse 12, I will ponder all your work and meditate on your mighty deeds. Sometimes when we're in the middle of our worst times of doubt and discouragement and despair, we have to make a decision, a conscious effort to go back to what we know to be true about God. Because if we just stay in our own circumstances and if we just work through how we feel, what we can see around us, our faith dwindles and our doubt creeps in and it rises up, and even the enemy has an opportunity to pull us away from the truths of who God is. And our feelings and circumstances and what we can see of the world around us, I think too often determines our perspective on life. And that only leads us to more and more despair. Watch the evening news. It's discouraging. But when the character of God is the foundation for our life and how we think and how we respond and how we react and how we persevere through those trials of life, when the character of who He is our foundation, we're able to weather the storm. Because He does not change. Right? He is the same yesterday, today, and forever. The God of the Bible is our God. And Asaph makes a decision here in verses 11 or 12 to remember who God is and what He has done. He says, I will remember the deeds of the Lord. I will remember. I will ponder and meditate on your mighty deeds. And this isn't easy. When we're going through it and we're kind of down in the middle of it or at the bottom of it, it's not easy to make our minds kind of remove from our circumstances and our difficulties and focus on the person and the character of God. But it's necessary for us. And I think as we as we go throughout our lives and we begin to understand God more, and we have more time thinking about Him, learning about Him, understanding Him from the Scriptures, knowing who He is, knowing His heart, seeing His promises that He makes in the Old Testament that are fulfilled in the New, and understanding that He has never forgotten a promise. He has never not been faithful to us. The more we understand who He is, the more that we have at our disposal to make it through this kind of discouragement and doubt and despair. And then we begin to battle. And we have to stop, and we have to remove ourselves from our circumstances and put ourselves into the throne room of the ruler of the universe. And we rest in His power and in His goodness, and we begin to trust in Him. And it might not happen overnight, it might not happen quickly. This might be a process that takes us days. It might be a process that takes us years as we're struggling with circumstances of our life, or our life story, or some pain, or some trial, or some physical infirmities that we've been through or are going through. And as we battle with that, we begin to know God more. We begin to become more like Him. And that's where our relationship with God is forged. And that's where our love for Him is deepened and developed. And that's what it means to have a close, personal relationship with Him. And I think this is why journaling can be such a powerful tool in our relationship with God. I don't know if you journal or not, and I got to confess, I don't do it as much as I want to, and I don't do it enough. But there's been times where I have written down the deeds of the Lord, the wonders of old, not necessarily ancient times, but in my life, and in the last 30 years, or even in the last 5 years, just writing things down, or even in the last week, and meditating on those things, and realizing once you start writing things down, you start to really see, I think, all the ways that God is at work in those circumstances in your life. It brings to mind, wow, God, really, you worked this out, and you did this and this and this, which caused this, and God, you're amazing. And God, in the middle of all that, while I was going through it, and maybe I wasn't writing things down, maybe I wasn't thinking about you, I was in turmoil. I was not thinking correctly. I was worried. I was stressed. I was taking things into my own control. I was trying to solve my problems on my own. But now looking back, Lord, as I've written these things down and I can look at those, I really see that you were at work. And I can know that you have a plan for me. And you are faithful. And you've never broken a promise. Last Sunday Aaron talked about monuments in Psalm 78, the next psalm here. We talked about this legacy in the Old Testament, and they actually built physical monuments to the Lord to remember the things that He had done. And I think in some ways, I've seen people do some creative stuff with kind of monuments to the Lord. Whether it's framing a picture in some special way, or just journaling, or some type of memento or something from something in their life. And I think those things are good. I think they're powerful for us to remind us of the goodness of God. And when we're going through those difficult times, we get to like where Asaph did, where we have to make a decision to say, Lord, I'm going to kind of step out of whatever it is I'm going through, and I'm going to remember what you've done for me. Psalm 31, if you just want to flip back there's a couple of verses in here that have really been encouraging to me as I thought about Psalm 77. It's a great, great chapter. David's writing here, and he says, "In you, O Lord, I take refuge. You are a rock of refuge for me, my rock and my fortress." And verse 7, He says, I will rejoice and be glad in your steadfast love, because you have seen my affliction. You have known the distress of my soul. God is not inactive. This sickness and this gut-wrenching feeling that Asaph goes through in this despair of wondering if God is there and if He's at work in his life and if He really knows what I'm going through. David shares with us in this psalm that, yes, God does. He knows. He knows the distresses of my soul. And there's just some great encouraging words in here. And then down in verse 14, but I trust in you, O Lord. I say, you are my God. Verse 15, my times are in your hand. That's such an encouraging phrase for me. It's such an encouraging verse. To know that the sovereign ruler of the universe in His providence is holding my life in His hand, and He knows exactly the discouragement and the doubt and the despair that I'm going through, and He's protecting me. He's holding me. You feel hugged right now? At least you're getting a hug. So, verse 22, this is kind of where, I was kind of getting with Asaph, kind of having to stop and make a decision. And remember, verse 22, this is really neat little phrase here that I came across that the Lord just kind of used to encourage me. David says, I had said in my alarm, I am cut off from your sight. I have said in my alarm, I am cut off from your sight. The idea here is that it's this really quick reactionary kind of response. Like just focusing on his circumstances around him, and he's scared, he's terrified, he's you could even, just relate to what we're talking about in Psalm 77, just this doubt and this despair and this fear. And I said in my alarm, I'm cut off from your sight. Lord, you're not there. You don't care. You can't see. You are inactive in my life. Has your favor ceased? Has your love gone? Have you rejected me? Like Asaph says in verse 7, 8, 9. And it says in Psalm 31:22, the rest of that verse, but you heard my voice. You heard the voice of my pleas for mercy when I cried to you for help. Love the Lord, all you His saints. The Lord preserves the faithful and abundantly repays the one who acts in pride. Be strong. Let your heart take courage, all you who wait for the Lord. David kind of realizes, I kind of reacted real quick. I'm like, God, where are you? In my alarm, I wasn't thinking correctly. And that's kind of where, back to Psalm 77, where Asaph kind of has this correct thinking. He kind of makes this decision to remember the faithfulness of God. And so that brings us to the next D. You fired up, Whitney? 5 Ds here, buddy. This description, the description of God. Verses 13 and 14. And verse 13 is kind of the key verse, I think, for this psalm. Joey referenced it before we got started this morning. Your way, O God, is holy. What God is great like our God? Who can compare to our God? And so just like there's this progression or digression, I guess, of discouragement to doubt to despair to kind of down. All of a sudden, Asaph makes this decision to kind of have the right perspective, and he focuses on the good work of God, and he starts to kind of progress the other way into like, wow, when I think about God and His works and His wonderful deeds, His ways really are holy, and His ways, and who is great like our God? He's the greatest. Who can compare? This is the God of the Bible, our God, the one true God, the living God, the creator of the universe, who spoke all things into existence from the darkness. The God who will one day forever judge all evil and all evil men and all of mankind who is who is apart from Him, and mercifully, lovingly, forever rescue all those who, by faith in His Son, are His. There are no other gods like Him, little g gods. They are all lifeless, powerless inventions of man. Who can compare to our God? Now, this isn't anything you haven't ever heard before. But if you could just chew on that for a minute. And just whatever comes to your mind and your heart of the greatness of God and His incomparable greatness. Let that encourage your heart. Let that spur you on to weathering the storm of your life, whether you're in it now or whether it comes ahead, when it comes, to realize that your times are in His hands. Who is like our God? Verse 14, you are the God who works wonders. You are the God who does amazing things. You have made known your might among the peoples. Asaph moves from focusing on his troubles to focusing on God. He focuses on God's character and His power. Number one, His character. Your way, O God, is holy. The word holy means to be set apart. God is set apart from us. He is outside of us. He is not like us. We are like Him, made in His image. But God is transcendent. He is above us. He is completely perfect, completely good, completely wise, completely and perfectly loving. God never sleeps. He never slumbers. He never makes a mistake. He rules and reigns in every detail of the most powerful governments of the world and the smallest details of your life. Psalm 31, David said, you see my affliction. You know my troubles. He knows. He listens. He hears. He sees. You are not alone in your despair, is what this psalm is telling us. And so Asaph, again, he focuses on the character of God, and we could spend all day talking about the greatness of God. And again, these things aren't things you don't know, but it's just good sometimes to stop and really make ourselves hear those things again and trust the person of our God, our Father. And then secondly, His wondrous works. What God is like our God? Your way, O God, is holy. And then in verse 14, you are the God who does amazing things, who works wonders. You know, our minds first go to creation. Genesis chapter 1. You know, our beautiful, amazing, mind-blowing universe. You know, I don't know about you, but ever since I was a little kid, I've always just been fascinated with creation and animals and bugs and space and the ocean, and I'm scared to death of the ocean. Unless it's like Bahamas and I can see the sand, I'm scared to death of the ocean. I don't know what's down there. It's some scary stuff. But God made it all. It's just even, you know, the beautiful coral reefs of the Caribbean and the fish and the wildlife there, and all the way down to the dark depths of the, 5 miles down, and no man's ever gone that deep. And there's those little fish that like glow in the dark. How does that even happen? Those are awesome. And then they got the big old whales down there or whatever. And you think about the intricacies of just, the eye of a honeybee, and just have you ever seen that? How complex that is, and snowflakes, I showed the kids one time. We did a little family devotions time. We talked about snowflakes. We saw these microscopic pictures. Remember that, honey? And how everyone was everyone was different and just beautiful, amazing. It looked like heaven. All these little crystal things. It was just like incredible. God made all that, spoke it into existence, the galaxies of the stars of space. I mean, who is like our God? And by remembering the person of God and the works of God, Asaph really answers his own questions from verses 7, 8, and 9, right? Remember those questions that he asked. Will the Lord reject me forever? No. Will he never again be favorable? No. Has His steadfast love forever ceased? No. Are His promises at an end for all time? No. Has God forgotten to be gracious? No. Has He in anger shut up His compassion? No. So we see a description of God. And then the last D, I know you're really disappointed. Disappointed. That was a D too. Is declaration. Declaration of the love of God. So he describes who God is and what He's like, and then he declares God's love for us in verses 15 through 20. You with your arm redeemed your people. The psalmist declares God's love through the most amazing act that he had known God to do. And he refers here to the exodus of the people of Israel out of bondage in Egypt. Again, Aaron referenced this last week in Psalm 78. And for the people, God's people in the Old Testament, this is kind of like the greatest wonder that He had done. It was God really forming His story of redemption and taking a people for Himself out of Egypt, out of bondage, out of slavery, and into freedom and into following Him and knowing Him and into His great plan. And that's really, what the Old Testament is about, God's redemptive story pointing ahead. And Asaph here, he describes in very colorful terms the power of God over creation as He parted the Red Sea and allowed His people, the children of Israel, to be rescued and to escape. You remember that story? With your arm you redeemed the people. When the waters saw you, O God, they were afraid. The clouds poured out water. The skies gave forth thunder. Your arrows flashed on every side. The crash of your thunder was in the whirlwind. The earth trembled and shook. Your way was through the sea, your path through the great waters. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. It's kind of a little side note, but it's kind of interesting here. I guess I always really pictured the children of Israel going through the Red Sea on like a really nice sunny day. But it kind of sounds like, from right here, that it was like a major deal. Like earthquake, clouds, lightning, water up on the sides. Yeah, it was, yeah. I probably would have just been like, just don't look up, don't look up, don't look up. Just walk across the Red Sea. But in all that, God redeemed a people for Himself. That word redeemed means, to buy back. That God created this wonderful thing. He had this relationship with Adam and Eve. And then Adam and Eve, like we would have done, chose to believe the lie that God really didn't love them, that He really didn't know what was best for them, and they decided to want to be as powerful as Him and take their life into their own hands and live for themselves. And that brought sin into the world. And now God, as He had these people set aside, He wanted to buy them back for Himself, the nation of Israel. He wanted to make them the central part of His story in the Old Testament, to show His love, to show His greatness, to show His faithfulness, to show how He wanted to bless a people that would obey and follow Him. And the Exodus is one of the central themes to the story of God in the Old Testament because it points to His Son, Jesus. And in Jesus, God demonstrated the most powerful way He could have, His love to us. And He revealed to us His holiness and His faithfulness. Remember, that Exodus was preceded by the first Passover, where God commanded that every family, both Israelite and Egyptian at that time, would sacrifice a spotless lamb and spread it over the doorposts of their house. And as the angel of God passed over, those who had obeyed with that sacrifice would be spared. And those who did not, of course, would experience the death of their firstborn son. But you see, Jesus is our spotless lamb. He is our sacrifice. And we have an even greater story of redemption than even Asaph could even know or remember when he's writing this. Because Asaph looked forward to God redeeming His people, ultimately through a Savior. And we can look back to that Savior in Jesus and His work on a cross. Memorial Day is a time to honor those who have sacrificed for our country and served for our freedom. But more importantly, today is a time to remember the promises that God keeps about Himself and the love that He demonstrated to us in Jesus. As we take communion together this morning, that's exactly what we're doing. We're remembering the Passover Lamb, and that story of redemption in the Old Testament pointed us to Jesus, and He is the fulfillment of God's love for us. He is God Himself. And everything that Asaph wrote about remembering the works of the Lord and how His way is holy and who is like our God, that is Jesus. That is Jesus. What God rules and creates us, mankind, and then leaves His throne to be like us, to know our affliction and become a man of sorrows and be our sacrifice and die. The Creator dying to pay the price of the disobedience and rebelliousness of His own creation so that we could be rescued, redeemed, bought back to Himself. That's what communion is a remembrance for us of. When we face discouragement and doubt and despair, we can make a decision to focus on the character and the work of God, which we see most clearly in the death and resurrection of His only begotten Son, Jesus. When we look back to the cross, we can look forward in faith, trusting God to work out His plan for our lives, for our good, and for His glory. That's the ultimate deliverance, right? God doesn't promise, because of the curse of sin from Genesis chapter 3 and the fall and how death and pain and suffering entered into this world, which was not part of God's desire. Because God is holy and He's transcendent and He's outside of us and He's above us, He must righteously, in His holiness, judge that sin and that rebellion. But in His mercy and His love, He provides a way for us to become His child once again, to be redeemed, to be bought back through His Son. And He does not, because of that curse, promise us in the Scriptures that we will have every prayer that we hope to see happen come true. He doesn't promise to remove our afflictions from us. He doesn't promise to heal us of all of our disease and our cancer and our suffering and our trials and our relationships and our struggles. He doesn't. But He promises that one day, if we are His, we will ultimately be delivered forever in heaven with Him. And He promises to be faithful. He promises to never leave us, to never forsake or reject us. And so in the middle of all that, my prayer for us this morning is that we can focus on the cross. The one who died, who was buried, and who rose again to give us victory over sin, Satan, death, and hell. Give us life. Give us the forgiveness of our sin. Give us the ability to take our eyes off of our circumstances and our trials and our struggles around us and put them on God Himself, on Jesus, and weather the storm of our life for His good and for our glory. So, let's pray.